Civil servants are employees of the municipal, state, or federal government. Within cities, they often live in far-flung areas that are colloquially referred to as police or firefighter neighborhoods. The tendency of civil servants to live amongst each other has caused them to develop their own culture that is distinct from the rest of the city. But what values and customs do they share, and how do civil servants identify one another?
Yeah, I'm really interested to talk about this. I don't know, I've always kind of had it on my mind. I think I'm just a pretty typical citizen in terms of my interactions with city workers. Like, it just comes up through general bureaucratic stuff. I'm a car owner.
Yeah.
But no, it's an interesting side of city living.
Yeah, this was the topic you came up with.
Mm-hmm.
And I myself am a civil servant. I work for the government as a librarian, but I'm not a really good representative of what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, you're a bit of an outsider to them.
Yeah. Because civil servant culture, on average, it leans conservative, particularly in contrast to how liberal urban denizens usually are.
Yeah.
And I, as a librarian, that's one of the more liberal city departments.
Oh, definitely.
But I think it would be interesting to start out with the question of whether or not civil servants are a subculture or a social class. Because originally when you pitched this idea, you were like, what do you think of discussing civil servants as a subculture?
Yeah, that was the first kind of framing I found for it, because it's like, what I was specifically thinking about was like how they tend to marry each other. I was just thinking about like intermarriage more broadly. And it's interesting that like it's kind of become this cohesive, and then I started using the term class interchangeably a bit too. And so it's a lot of things.
We talk about subcultures a lot, but I think in this instance, it actually is more of a proper social class, which we in America, we don't think about social class very much, or we try not to.
Yes.
Because it makes us very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's not as clearly outlined as the more like British system of it. So it means we actually spend like more time thinking about it and less time talking about it, I would say.
Yeah. Within America, though, I think the civil servant class, if you want to call it that, it is so distinct, though, once you notice it. Like, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah. And a lot of this episode is going to be, as per usual, like from a very Chicago-y perspective. But I think this is like, there's some similarities, I would say, broadly across the like legacy transit cities specifically, but just all the kind of older American cities as opposed to like newer Sun Belt cities like Phoenix or Las Vegas, per se.
Yeah. I think a lot of the symbols we're going to talk about do apply to the Sun Belt. But some of the other things we'll get to, like regional accents, you don't see them as much there.
Definitely.
But one of the things that I think really makes civil servants somewhat of their own social class is the fact that they're geographically bound. Because throughout history, say if you were a serf or a peasant, you're bound to the land that you grew your crops on. And then if you were an aristocrat, the land that you were responsible for governing, you were bound to that as well. So you are geographically bound. And civil servants are as well through what are called residency requirements.
Yeah, residency requirements, like, it's interesting. Their origins are very, like, practical. It was just that, with better and better technologies that let people live further, there was still a concern about how quickly an emergency worker, like a fireman or policeman, could get to work.
Yeah.
But then cars kind of upended that, because you would often end up with situations where it's faster to get from the suburbs into the city than it is, like, cross city. So they kind of lost that rationale for it. But then it became important because this was the era of urban decay, as they call the 70s. And there was just a widespread panic about cities essentially like bottoming out in terms of like economic activity, safety, and all that. So cities started to panic and seeing that like, oh, if we lose our policemen and firefighters, like we've already lost the office workers residency wise in their tax base. So who do we actually have control over? And it's our own employees.
Yeah, I think the rationale, or the way I've always thought of it, is that it's to protect the city's bottom line. It's like, why not require your workforce to also be part of the tax base? But especially from the policing angle, there's this other sort of incentive that you found this article that makes a really good point about it.
Yeah, so this is an article from 1980. And it's a really cool time capsule because, I don't know, thinking about the exact year 1980, this is like after the urban malaise of the 70s, are kind of still feeling it, but before the kind of yuppies returning to cities, like revitalization and condo boom across a lot of the country's downtowns. So the whole paper is in favor of residency requirements broadly, but it says we need them, but it doesn't guarantee that they're going to fix the urban free fall. basically. But they bring up the very key issue that always comes back around, which is that you don't want a kind of resentment to form with city workers, where they see the city as this like necessary evil. It's just their work. It's just their 8 hours a day or whatever. And then they go back to the place they actually like. I think the sad thing is that feeling is still present even with residency requirements. Even if those people live in the city proper, that resentment can still develop. And I think I don't want to be too defeatist about it, but it just seems like a kind of natural thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think they, in some ways, are even more resentful that they're forced to. They look for additional reasons to be like, man, I have to stay here. I don't want to.
Yeah, because it feels like, it almost feels like it's this very stick approach as opposed to carrot for like luring city workers in. Like instead of just giving them like, I don't know, like a housing subsidy or something, that could be seen as too much of a handout. But instead they're just forced to by, a document somewhere that says you have to live here. So I think that kind of creates a little bit of resentment in itself.
Yeah. But this doesn't fully explain the phenomenon. So municipal workers in particular, they're required to live in the city, but that doesn't explain all of it because then they cluster in neighborhoods together. I think that's what really makes them a distinct culture. It's the fact that their neighbors are often of a similar like profession.
Yeah. And it's like, I don't know, in American assimilation, like you have these very tight-knit ethnic neighborhoods that eventually kind of dissipate and become just more of a general mix, or they become, extremely gentrified and become high earning, or they, kind of collapse in on themselves sometimes. But this seems like a surprisingly durable form of geographic community identity. Yeah. I will say these neighborhoods don't seem like these neighborhoods, they're often as old as the rest of the city, maybe a little bit younger because they're often on the periphery and just the rate at which cities develop. But them being this kind of like job locked like neighborhood, like a police neighborhood, that seems to be very recent from what I've read about it. It's kind of like a cars onward kind of thing. It's a very post World War II thing.
Yeah.
But I'm also kind of curious about the motivations itself. Like, we talk about the very natural urge for city workers to want to move outside, then they're forced to live on the edge. But why do they yearn for this in general? Why particularly city workers?
I think it's because their work environments are kind of stressful and they have to witness antisocial behavior, which then makes them really value the domestic sphere. They look forward to going home and seeing their families. And the larger, more suburban-style homes they can find on the edge of the cities, the draw of them is the domestic sphere. Yeah. So that's why they end up wanting to live there.
I think that makes a lot of sense of why these neighborhoods are so called like firefighter and cop neighborhoods. And they just kind of, I think they create the first step. I think it's the firefighters and cops, the emergency workers who like have the most hectic, like see the worst of cities in a lot of ways that lead the charge. And then I think their kind of presence pulls out through their connections with other departments and stuff, other city workers.
Yeah.
Never heard someone describe a neighborhood as a water commissioner town, water board or whatever.
Or even a teacher neighborhood.
Yeah, no, I haven't heard that either.
Yeah.
But there is what brought us to this topic is that phenomenon of city workers marrying each other, of like so many like librarian wife, cop husband, firefighter husband, teacher wife.
I mean, I haven't encountered that too much, like librarian wife, cop husband.
No.
I don't know if any of my coworkers really date city workers, but fun fact, my last boyfriend was working for a city department.
Yeah,
and we worked across the street from each other. I don't want to say which one he worked for, but yeah, we were so like equally matched at that stage of our life.
Yeah, no, just two city workers. So interesting.
Yeah. But even though I think a lot of municipal workers that live in civil servant neighborhoods that have grown to value them, they don't actually really want to keep the system in place that has given rise to what their neighborhoods are today.
Yeah.
Like a lot of them have pushed for residency requirement repeals, some of which have been successful, like in the last couple of years during the Great Resignation. St. Louis and Philadelphia both got rid of their residency requirements for cops.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like from reading that whole article, I feel like I'm like this expert on the residency requirements and I want to say like, no, stop what you're doing. But it makes a lot of sense in just how decisions are made that the benefits of repeal are very visible. It's like, hey, we have a staffing shortage. We should do anything to solve that. The city would be more dangerous if we have an understaffed force. So if you just look at it in that very like small network, then you have a measurable problem that you can solve by expanding the net. And all the downsides of repealing these residency requirements, there's like lower community trust, there's like more misunderstandings, more escalation of violence when like cops are this has been measured basically.